DiscerningHearts.com, in cooperation with the Oblates of the Virgin Mary, presents Spiritual Desolation. Be aware, understand, take action with Father Timothy Gallagher. Father Gallagher is a member of the Oblates of the Virgin Mary, a religious community dedicated to retreats and spiritual formation according to the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. He is featured on several series found on the Eternal Word television network. He is also author of numerous books on the spiritual teachings of St. Ignatius of Loyola and the Venerable Bruno Lanteri, founder of the Oblates of the Virgin Mary, all published by the Crossroads Publishing Company. This particular series is based in part on Chapter 4 of Setting Captives Free, Personal Reflections on Ignatian Discernment of Spirits. Spiritual Desolation. Be aware, understand, take action with Father Timothy Gallagher. I'm your host, Chris McGregor.
In the last three rules, Ignatius shifts his focus just slightly from spiritual desolation to the other basic tactic of the enemy, which is temptation. Temptation is a deceptive suggestion of the enemy. Why don't you let your prayer go till later? You can let yourself see that. It doesn't have to get too far out of hand, and so forth. And what Ignatius does in the last three rules is to highlight in each of them one quality of how the enemy works in his temptations, so that being aware of this, understanding it, being able to name it, we know how to take action to reject it. And in Rule 12, Ignatius encourages us, when the enemy first brings his temptation, the man at 10 o'clock, nothing in him wants to reach out for the Bible as he usually does at this time. Everything in him wants to reach out for the smartphone in a way that will be, to use Ignatian vocabulary, low and earthly. Obviously, there's a good use of phones and so on, but we all know what we're describing here.
12th Rule. The enemy acts like a woman in being weak when faced with strength and strong, and faced with weakness. For, as it is proper to a woman when she is fighting with some man to lose heart and to flee when the man confronts her firmly, and, on the contrary, if the man begins to flee, losing heart, the anger, vengeance, and ferocity of the woman grow greatly and know no bounds. In the same way it is proper to the enemy to weaken and lose heart, fleeing, and causing his temptations when the person who is exercising himself in spiritual things confronts the temptations of the enemy firmly, doing what is diametrically opposed to them, and, on the contrary, if the person who is exercising himself begins to be afraid and lose heart in suffering the temptations, there is no beast so fierce on the face of the earth as the enemy of human nature in following out his damnable intention with such growing malice.
What Ignatius counsels him with great insistence is stand firm right in the very beginning of the temptation. When is it easiest for this man to resist that temptation, or any of us? One of us finds churning thoughts of anger toward another person just beginning to arise, or churning thoughts of anxiety just beginning to rise. When is it easiest to resist these? Right in the very beginning. The image that I use is, here is a high mountain covered with snow, and here at the mountain peak, a snowball is just getting started. You can put out a finger and stop it. Now, the listeners can't see it, but I'm extending my right hand with the finger extended in an upward direction. You know, this gesture has become, I sometimes use it in spiritual direction, because when people smile, they know exactly what it means. You can put out a finger and stop it as it's just getting started, but let it get halfway down the mountainside, gaining mass and speed, it'll run you over. So if the man does pick up the smartphone and one touch becomes 50 and 100 and 200, it will get harder and harder and heavier, and it will be more and more difficult to resist the temptation. I love Rule 12 because if we employ it, it will save us an enormous amount of suffering. The snowball never even gets started. And so all of those heavy struggles need not happen. It's the difference between the way Eve responds to the tempter in Genesis 3. Did God really say it? Well, God said, and she engages in the dialogue, and the snowball is rolling down the side of the mountain, and she succumbs. The difference between that and the way Jesus responds to the tempter in the desert, command that these stones become bread. It is written, not by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God shall man live. Jesus' response is immediate, it's total, it's definitive, and the temptation is over. So that the movement toward that response is the gift of Rule 12. In Rule 13, Ignatius wants us to see that the enemy will encourage us to keep hidden in our hearts the various burdens that he places there, the doubts, the fears. How can God love someone like me when this has been part of my... Probably here more than anywhere else in the rules, I speak with a very great reverence, because Rule 13 can touch very deep places in our, but touch them to liberate us, so that we no longer are held captive in these places. And the encouragement is to speak with a wise and competent spiritual person. The image that Ignatius uses is of the false lover attempting to seduce and use for a selfish purpose an upright woman. His whole urging is to her, keep quiet about this, don't say anything. Because he knows that in the moment, let's say the wife speaks with her husband or the daughter with her father, the whole game is up. All she has to do is speak about it, and he is defeated. Which really reveals, as Ignatius says in Rule 13, in Rule 12, the essential weakness of the enemy. Words alone can defeat this enemy. The right words said to the right person.
13th Rule. Likewise, he conducts himself as a false lover, in wishing to remain secret and not being revealed. For a dissolute man who, speaking with evil intention, makes dishonorable advances to a daughter of a good father, or a wife, or a good husband, wishes his words and persuasions to be secret, and the contrary displeases him very much. When the daughter reveals to her father, or the wife to her husband, his false wounds and depraved intention, because he easily perceives that he will not be able to succeed with the undertaking begun. In the same way, when the enemy of human nature brings his wiles and persuasions to the just soul, he wishes and desires that they be received and kept in secret. But when one reveals them to one's good confessor, or to another spiritual person who knows his deceits and malicious designs, it weighs on him very much, because he perceives that he will not be able to succeed with the malicious undertaking he has begun, since his manifest deceits have been revealed.
And so Ignatius gives two profiles of the person with whom we would speak. Priest that we know through the sacrament of reconciliation, and whom we know to be wise and spiritually competent. Or Ignatius amplifies the profile to another spiritual person. This could be a priest or religious or layman or woman. But the key thing is that this is a person, he says, who knows the enemy's deceits and malicious designs, so that this is a wise and competent spiritual person. And if we can do that, the enemy's undone. Rule 13 and Rule 5 together will get us through any spiritual darkness we may ever face. Don't make changes in the darkness of the desolation, and speak with a wise and competent spiritual person. Those two things together. I once was teaching these rules to a group, and I said, someday I want to see a T-shirt that says, I heart Rule 5 and Rule 13. And a few months later in the mail, I got a package. One of them had the shirt made. I still have it. And then finally in Rule 14, almost as though Ignatius saves the best for last, Ignatius invites us to recognize that, and there's no shame in this is just the spiritual life, lived in a fallen, yes, but loved and redeemed world. There is some place where all of us are most vulnerable to the enemy's temptations and spiritual desolations. The image Ignatius uses is of one of these castles set up in the high ground in the Europe of his day. A group of rapacious thieves come to try to sack and pillage and rob and destroy. And the leader astutely studies the defenses of the castle, the walls, the repair, the towers, and so on, and finds the weakest point, has an astute sense of that, and the attack begins right there. And the encouragement then is to do this ourselves, to look at the whole of our spiritual reality, identify. Self-knowledge is always key in the spiritual life. identify where we are most vulnerable, and we'll know that by noting the place where we most often get discouraged or tripped up. I'm stopping here because I think it's really important when we speak of self-knowledge. Self-knowledge can feel a little daunting. Not the most comfortable thing in the world, but I guess I need to do it. No. Self-knowledge is the most beautiful thing in the world, because when we come to know ourselves according to our truth, we discover ourselves as beloved sons and daughters of our Heavenly Father. That's our deepest identity. In Jesus, we are adopted sons and daughters. We are brought into that life. We are loved. There's a beautiful line from the Catholic existentialist philosopher Gabriel Marcel, which is the deepest truth of our lives. I've never forgotten it. To be is to be loved. To be is to be loved. If I exist, it's only because I was loved into existence, and I am loved at every moment. And the desire in the lover with the capital L in God's heart is that that love relationship continue for eternity. So self-knowledge is the most beautiful thing in the world. It's like the thrill when you realize he really loves me. She really loves me. And I know it now. That's what self-knowledge is most deeply. And because of that, then once we know that deepest identity, then everything in us wants to embrace it, to be open to it, to receive it. And therefore, we don't want anything that diminishes our freedom. And that's what we're looking at in Rule 14.
14th Rule. Likewise, he conducts himself as a leader, intent upon conquering and robbing what he desires. For just as a captain and leader of an army in the field, pitching his camp and exploring the fortifications and defenses of a stronghold, attacks it at the weakest point, in the same way the enemy of human nature, roving about, looks in turn at all our theological, cardinal, and moral virtues, and where he finds us weakest and most in need for our eternal salvation, there he attacks and attempts to take us.
Where is that deep identity most vulnerable? All right, let's set to work there. So in the image, the townspeople see that place in the wall, maybe where the masonry is not in good repair. They strip it away, replace it, make it stronger than it was before. Now the weak place is no longer weak. So the way I would summarize Rule 14 is it's a rule which brings hope where we feel least hopeful. It's that one area where we say, well, St. Ignatius, I can see how your rules are going to be helpful in so many ways, but I don't really think this one area is ever going to change. That's the area Ignatius is addressing in Rule 14, and it's right there that he wants to bring hope.
We'll return to Spiritual Desolation. Be aware, understand, take action with Father Timothy Gallagher in just a moment.
Hello, my name is Deacon Omar Gutierrez, and I want to ask you to support Discerning Hearts in a special way. We, Chris McGregor, the board, and I all know that not everyone listening can help financially. We know we have listeners from all parts of the world, and we have made a commitment since the beginning to make the truths shared through Discerning Hearts totally free. So while you may not be able to contribute financially, what you can do is certainly pray, but also give us positive reviews on whatever platform you use to listen to us. If it's iTunes, Android, Stitcher, or Spotify, however it is that you get these podcasts, or if you're on YouTube and you like our videos, please give us a good rating and write a review. The more good ratings and reviews we get, the higher our profile, and the more listeners will discover us, listeners who may have the means to contribute in the future. Please consider rating us and writing a positive review today.
A prayer of St. Ignatius of Loyola.
Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will, all that I have and call my own. You have given all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only your love and your grace. That is enough for me. Amen.
We now return to Spiritual Desolation. Be aware, understand, take action with Father Timothy Gallagher. And what's wonderful is what came before it in Rule 13. You are not walking alone. You have someone you're talking with. You have either the good confessor or you have that spiritual person who, that when you become aware of yourself and that area, and it is like hitting a fire. It's hitting something. You don't want to look at it. That's the time to bring that out in the light. 13 and 14 seem to be united in a very real way.
They are very much. And I think you could actually extend that, say that Rule 13 embraces all the rules. Because in the long run, if we are going to live the discerning life and move toward freedom from captivity, I think what's going to sustain it is being accompanied. We can do a lot alone, and there are people who really have no other choice, and I want to reverence that. But today it's easier and easier to be accompanied. Even what we're doing right now, I'm sure that these conversations can serve as accompaniment for listeners. But anything we can do to multiply the ways in which we are accompanied is going to strengthen us enormously in living this Ignatian wisdom and the spiritual life in general. So, are there ways we can get involved in the parish? Is there a prayer group? Is there a Bible study group? Are there groups that are exploring teachings like this about the spiritual life? And of course, they're all over the place today. There are so many digital resources or recorded talks, DVDs, and so forth that groups can use, to go forward with these things. Can a husband and wife together share this journey? Can families in various ways share this journey? I remember one woman telling me that she and her husband, they had either 4 or 5 young children, what they would do is at the supper table, and she said in the midst of spilt milk and everything else, they would invite their children to talk about these 2 questions. What are you most grateful for in today? What are you least grateful for? And beautiful sharings it was a very simple way, actually, of introducing at that age the examen prayer, which is what they were really doing. They called it the family examen. So in the family, and with reverence, because I know it's not always possible in some situations in marriages, but where it is possible, and it can be possible in many cases, it's a beautiful thing to accompany each other in this. Just friends in the Lord who are not trying to be each other's spiritual director. In a time of spiritual desolation, if I know that I can go on Skype and speak with a friend, or pick up the phone and speak with a friend, or FaceTime, or whatever way we communicate, it can make all the difference. If we can find formal spiritual direction, obviously that's a very beautiful thing. I think one resource that we can use, I'd say generally speaking, can be used much more than it is being used, is the sacrament of confession, because that is one place where everyone can find a way to speak, if only briefly, about their spiritual experience. If we find that good confessor that Ignatius is speaking about, a priest who is wise in the spiritual life and is willing to add that extra minute or 2, which may be all that it will take in confession, just to give us spiritual counsel. You might try this in your life of prayer, or in that struggle that you mentioned, you might find this would be helpful. And we go to confession regularly. That's a powerful source of being accompanied in the spiritual life. To make retreats. Make an annual retreat if we can, for example, or whenever we can. If it's just one day, if it's a weekend in a retreat house somewhere. And in the course of that, have a chance to speak with the retreat director or spiritual directors who may be provided. If we build a network like this so that we are accompanied, then the wisdom of Rule 13, so that we're not just alone with the burden in our hearts, but there are places in which appropriately, and it will be different, what will be appropriate will be different in each of these instances. But in the tapestry of that, we will be enormously strengthened.
In that sense of be aware, understand, take action, once that becomes everyday aspect of our own lives, then in that humility that you spoke of, you can begin to listen and hear and help others come to that juncture too. The parent, just as you said, the listening parent, listening to what the child has to share, the spouse listening in humility, not so much to jump with a prideful, well, I know, and so I'm going to tell you. That doesn't help them, and it ultimately harms you. But in a humble action, just to sit back and to listen, it's amazing what God can do in that.
Well, I think you touched something fundamental in what you just said, Chris. I think the mark of a person living the life of discernment really is humility, because when you try to live it, you see more and more how much you miss. In all the kaleidoscope of spiritual experience going on in the changing thoughts and stirrings of the heart in the course of the day, I'll just say of myself, I couldn't put a percentage on it, but I certainly miss a lot more than I see. But I know that even that little that I see makes a dramatic difference in my life. When Ignatius' eyes were opened, how much were they open? Until one time he says his eyes were opened a little. There was a lot he didn't see, but what he did see was this one thread in his spiritual experience, that a set of thoughts about living in one way always left him sad, and a set of thoughts about living in another way always left him feeling happy. And that was enough for God to completely transform his life. In fact, Ignatius, in a letter to St. Francis Borgia, one of the early Jesuits, says, "For myself, I am convinced that I am mostly an obstacle." But again, with our goodwill, which is all God needs, and our sincere efforts to learn and apply the teaching Ignatius is giving here, that's all God needs to do two things in our lives: to bring into our spiritual life a rich step in personal transformation toward holiness, and to make of us agents of renewal in the church, or to use the language the church is using today, agents of a new evangelization. When people look at a person who is really living this, and they see a kind of peace, they see someone who goes through the struggles of life, but without succumbing or being engulfed in anxiety and just becoming a burden to self and to others. There's something deeply, deeply attractive about that, and we want that. And so to live the discerning life doesn't mean getting up on a soapbox, really. There will be times when, and I've seen people do this, when people say, "Could you share that teaching with me?" And in the home, creating a group in the parish, in many ways people do that. But the deepest thing will be just the personal witness. Remember how they, in the early decades of Christianity, they see how these Christians love one another. We want to know more about this. That's what happens when we live the discerning life. People see a solidity, a peace that draws them, and that they want to know more about. This actually ties into something else. You know that in the culture around us now, there is the vogue of mindfulness, which is very widely spread. And I have to say, compared to the frenetic, heedless pace of life around us, that whole effort to become more aware, I think, is a very positive step. It has its limitations, obviously. It's not born out of Christianity and so on. But letting that be, and now looking at our Christian lives, if we live with this first step in discernment, which is just be aware, notice, get in touch with, do we ever slow down enough to be aware of the stirrings in our hearts and in our thoughts? And if we use the language of Jean-Pierre de Caussade, an abandonment to divine providence, to find God in the present moment. This whole invitation of these rules is, now let's use an explicitly Christian vocabulary focused on Christ. It's an invitation to Christian awareness. It's an invitation to awareness of the Lord Jesus working in our hearts, working in the thoughts, or if we want to use Ignatian language, awareness of the good Spirit, the Holy Spirit, the good angels, God's work of grace within us. And that makes all the difference. And I think in our contemporary culture, it's all the more important. So just that first step alone, do we ever do that? Just sit quietly before the Lord and become aware of the spiritual experience that's going on. Now, once we become aware of it, then the need that immediately arises, I need to understand this. So I'm feeling an attraction toward taking this step. I'm feeling a resistance toward taking that step. I'm finding myself joyful when I think of this. I find myself anxious when I think of that. What's of God and not of God? Or again, to use Ignatian language, what's of the good spirit and what's of the enemy in that? That's the second step, and of course that leads to the action, at which point we're now living the discerning life. So yes, to come back all the way to your original observation, the more we are accompanied, the stronger we will be in living the discerning life. And then finally, where it all leads is captives set free. I'm looking now at an icon of Jesus who is, and the tombs are opened and he is raising people from the tombs. They're being set free from captivity, and an open door to a locked door that is now open and the way out. And above all, the cross of Christ, which is the deepest source of our freedom.
You've been listening to Spiritual Desolation. Be aware, understand, take action with Father Timothy Gallagher. This particular series is based in part on Chapter 4 of Setting Captives Free, Personal Reflections on Ignatian Discernment of Spirits. You can find this book on Father Gallagher's website at fathertimothygallagher.org. To hear and or to download this episode, along with hundreds of other spiritual formation programs, visit discerninghearts.com. This has been a production of Discerning Hearts in cooperation with the Oblates of the Virgin Mary. We hope that if this has been helpful for you, that you will first pray for our mission. And if you feel us worthy, consider a charitable donation, which is fully tax deductible, to help support our efforts. But most of all, we hope that you will tell a friend about discerninghearts.com and join us next time for Spiritual Desolation. Be aware, understand, take action with Father Timothy Gallagher.